Alright, so this first story is going to be a request that I got in the comments from Toothtown 1914. Appreciate you, my man. Yeah, this one's for you. In June of 1972, a woman appeared in Cedar Sinai Hospital in nothing but a white, blood-covered gown. Now, this in itself should not be too surprising, as people often have accidents nearby and come to the nearest hospital for medical attention. But there were two things that caused people who saw her to vomit and flee in terror. The first thing being that she wasn't exactly human. She resembled something pretty close to a mannequin, but had the dexterity and the fluidity of a normal human being. Her face was as flawless as a mannequin's. No eyebrows and smeared in makeup. There was a kitten clamped in her jaws so unnaturally tight that no teeth could be seen, and the blood was still squirting out over her gown and onto the floor. She then pulled it out of her mouth, tossed it aside, and collapsed. From the moment she stepped through the entrance to when she was taken to the hospital room and cleaned up before being prepared for sedation, she was completely calm, expressionless, and motionless even. The doctors thought it would be best to restrain her until the police could arrive, and she didn't argue. They were unable to get any kind of response from her actually, and most staff members felt way too uncomfortable to even look in her direction for more than a few seconds. But the second the staff tried to sedate her, she fought back with extreme force. Two members of staff had to hold her down as her body rose up from the bed with that same blank expression. She turned her emotionless eyes towards the male doctor and did something unusual. She smiled. As she did, the female doctor screamed and let go out of shock. In the woman's mouth, no, they weren't teeth, but long, sharp spikes, too long for her mouth to even close without causing any damage. The male doctor stared back at her for a moment before asking, "What in the hell are you?" She cracked her neck down to her shoulder to observe him. Still smiling, there was a long pause. The security had been alerted and could be heard coming down the hallway. As she heard them approach, she darted forward, sinking her teeth into the front of his throat, ripping out his jugular and letting him fall straight to the floor, gasping for air as he choked on his own blood. She stood up and leaned over him, her face coming dangerously close to his as the life faded from his eyes. She leaned closer and whispered in his ear, "I am God." The doctor's eyes filled with fear as he watched her calmly walk away to greet the security. His last ever sight would be watching her feast on them one by one. The female doctor who survived the incident named her the Expressionless. There was never a sighting of her again. I sat on the bus on my way to school, listening to music and paying little to no attention to other students. At one of the stops, my mind snapped back to reality. I looked towards the small house, Tommy's house. I thought. A hand slipped through the drapes of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. He's sick, I thought. The day flew by. I watched the local news channel after school, and what I heard paralyzed me. Tommy's entire family was murdered that day by an unknown suspect. After hearing this news, I moved back up to my room and quietly fell asleep. The next day, when I got on the bus, we drove past Tommy's house, and the bus driver, completely unaware of the tragedy that happened to Tommy's family, stopped at his home. As I was about to get up and explain to her what had happened, something caught my eye. A pale hand slipped through the drapes of the window and waved the bus driver to move on. I sat on the bus, terrified. Russian researchers in the late 1940s kept 5 people awake for 15 days using an experimental gas-based stimulant. They were kept in a sealed environment to carefully monitor their oxygen intake so the gas didn't kill them, since it was lethal in high concentrations. This was before modern cameras, so they had only microphones and 5-inch thick glass porthole-sized windows into the chamber to monitor them. The chamber was stocked with books, cots to sleep on with no bedding, running water, and a toilet. Also, enough dried food to last all 5 for over a month. The test subjects were political prisoners deemed enemies of the state during World War II. Everything was okay for the first 5 days. The subjects were falsely promised that they would be freed after doing this test, and they hardly complained about it. The conversations that were had and activities were monitored, and it was noted that they continued to talk about increasingly traumatic incidents in their past. The way they started talking to each other took a darker turn around the 4th day. After 5 days, that's when they started to complain about the circumstances and the events that led them to where they are. They started to demonstrate severe paranoia. They stopped talking to each other and began alternating whispering to the microphones and the one-way mirrored portholes. Oddly, they all seemed to think they could win the trust of the experimenters by turning over their comrades. At first, the researchers suspected this was an effect of the gas itself. After 9 days, the first of them started screaming. He paced around the length of the chamber, repeatedly yelling at the top of his lungs for 3 hours straight. He continued to try to scream, but was only able to produce occasional squeaks. The researchers realized that he had physically torn his vocal cords. The most surprising thing about this behavior is how the other captives reacted to it, or rather didn't react to it. They just started whispering into the microphones until the second group of the captives started to scream. The only 2 people who were not screaming took the books apart, smeared page after page with their own feces, and pasted them calmly all over the glass portholes. The screaming abruptly stopped. Also did the whispering in the microphones. After 3 more days passed, the researchers checked the microphones hourly to make sure that they were still working. They thought it was impossible that no sound could be coming with 5 people inside. The oxygen usage in the chamber indicated that all 5 must still be alive. In fact, it was the amount of oxygen 5 people would consume at a very heavy level of strenuous exercise. On the 14th day, in the morning, the group of researchers did something that all of them said they absolutely would not do. They used the intercom inside the chamber, hoping to provoke any response from the captives because they thought they were either dead or just in a vegetative state. They announced, "We are opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you'll be shot. Compliance will earn one of you your immediate freedom." To their surprise, they heard a single phrase and a calm voice response: "We no longer want to be freed." Debate broke out among the researchers and the military forces funding the research, unable to antagonize any more response using the intercom. It was finally decided to open the chamber at midnight on the 15th day. The chamber was flushed of the stimulant gas and filled with fresh air. Then immediate voices from the microphones began to object. 3 different voices began begging, as if they were pleading for the life of loved ones to turn the gas back on. The chamber was opened and soldiers sent in to retrieve the test subjects. They started to scream louder than ever. Well, when the soldiers found what was inside, they started screaming as well. 4 of the 5 subjects were still alive, although no one could rightly call the state that any of them were in life. The food rations past day 5 had not been so much as touched. There were chunks of meat from the dead test subjects' thighs and chest stuffed in the train. blocking the drain and allowing 4 inches of water to accumulate on the floor. All 4 surviving test subjects also had large portions of muscle and skin torn away from their bodies. The destruction of flesh and exposed bone on their fingertips indicated that the wounds were inflicted by hand, not with teeth as the researchers initially thought. Upon closer examination of the position and angles of the wounds indicated that most, if not all of them, were self-inflicted. The abdominal organs below the rib cage of all 4 test subjects had been removed. The only ones in place were the heart, lungs, and the diaphragm. The skin, as well as most of his muscles attached to his ribs, had been ripped off, exposing the lungs through the rib cage. All the blood vessels and organs remained intact. They had just been taken out and laid on the floor, fanning out around the eviscerated but still living bodies of the subjects. The digestive tract of all 4 could be seen to be working, digesting food. It quickly became apparent that what they were digesting was their own flesh they had been ripped off and eaten over the course of days. Most of the soldiers were Russian special operatives at the facility, but still many refused to return to the chamber to remove the test subjects. They continued to scream to be left in the chamber, and alternately begged and demanded that the gas be turned back on so that they fall asleep. To everyone's surprise, the test subjects put on a fierce fight in the process of being removed from the chamber. One of the Russian soldiers died from having his throat ripped out. Another one was gravely injured by having his testicles ripped off and an artery in his leg severed by one of the subject's teeth. Another 5 of the soldiers lost their lives, if you count ones that offed themselves in the weeks following the incident. In the struggle, one of the 4 living subjects had his spleen ruptured and he bled out almost immediately. The medical team attempted to sedate him, but this proved impossible. He was injected with more than 10 times the human dose of a morphine derivative and still fought like a cornered animal, breaking the ribs and arms of one doctor. When the heart was seen to beat for a full 2 minutes after he had bled out, to the point there was more air in his vascular system than blood. Even after it stopped, he continued to scream and flail for another 3 minutes, struggling to attack anyone in reach and just repeating the word "more" over and over, weaker and weaker, until he finally fell silent. The surviving 3 test subjects were heavily restrained and moved to a medical facility. The 2 that had their vocal cords still attached continuously begged for the gas. The most injured of the 3 was taken to the only surgical operating room. In the process of preparing the subject to have his organs placed back within his body, it was found that he was effectively immune to the sedative they had given him. He fought furiously against his restraints when the anesthetic gas was brought out to put him under. He managed to tear most of his way through a 4-inch wide leather strap on one wrist, even though the weight of a 200-pound soldier was holding that wrist as well. It only took a little more anesthetic than normal to put him under, and the moment his eyelid fluttered and closed, his heart stopped. In the autopsy of the test subject that died on the operating table, it was found that his blood had tripled the level of oxygen, his muscles that were still attached to his skeleton were badly torn, and he had broken 9 bones in this struggle. Most of them were from the force of his own muscles. The second survivor had been the first of the group of 5 to start screaming. His vocal cords destroyed. He was unable to beg or object to the surgery. He only reacted by shaking his head violently in disapproval when he got the anesthetic gas. He shook his head yes when someone suggested reluctantly they try the surgery without anesthetic, and did not react for the entire 6-hour procedure of replacing his abdominal organs and attempting to cover them with what remained of his skin. The surgeon proceeding stated repeatedly that it shouldn't be medically possible for the patient to still be alive. One terrified nurse assisting the surgery stated that she had seen the patient's mouth curl into a smile several times whenever his eyes met hers. When the surgery ended, the patient looked at the surgeon and began to wheeze loudly, attempting to talk while struggling to do so. Assuming this must be something of drastic importance, the surgeon had a pen and pad fetched so the patient could write his message. It was simple: keep cutting. The other 2 test subjects were given the same surgery, both without anesthetic. Although they had to be injected with a paralytic agent for the duration of the operation, the surgeon found it important to perform the operation while the patients laughed continuously. Once paralyzed, the subjects could only follow the attending researchers with their eyes. The paralytic compound cleared their system in an abnormal short amount of time. They were soon trying to escape their bonds. The moment they could speak, they were again asking for the stimulant gas. The researchers tried asking why they had injured themselves, why they had ripped out their own guts, and even why they wanted to be given the gas again. Only one response was given: I must remain awake. All 3 subjects' restraints were reinforced and they were placed back into the chamber, awaiting determination as to see what should be done with them. Researchers, facing the wrath of their own military benefactors for having failed the stated goals of their project, considering euthanizing the surviving subjects, the commanding officer in charge, a former KGB agent, instead saw potential and wanted to see what would happen if they were put back on the gas. The researchers strongly objected to this, but of course were overruled. In preparation for being sealed in the chamber again, the subjects were connected to an EEG monitor and had their restraints padded for long-term confinement. To everyone's surprise, all 3 stopped struggling the moment it was let slip that they were going back in the gas. It was obvious that at this point, all 3 were putting up a great struggle to stay awake. One of the subjects that could speak was humming loudly and continuously. The mute subject was straining his legs against the leather bonds with all his might. First left, then right, then left again for something to focus on. The remaining subject was holding his head off his pillow and blinking rapidly. Having been the first to be wired for EEG, most of the researchers were monitoring his brainwaves and surprised they were normal. But it did have some times where it flatlined inexplicably. It looked as if he were repeatedly suffering from brain death before returning to normal. As they focused on paper scrolling out on the brainwave monitor, only one nurse saw his eyes slip shut at the same moment his head hit that pillow. His brainwaves immediately changed to that of a deep sleep, then flatlined for the last time as his heart simultaneously stopped. The only remaining subject that could speak started screaming to be sealed in now. His brainwaves showed the same flat lines as the one who had just died from falling asleep. The commander gave the order to seal the chamber with both subjects inside, as well as 3 researchers. One of the 3 immediately drew his gun and shot the commander point blank between the eyes, then turned the gun on the mute subject and blew his brains out as well. He pointed his gun at the remaining subject, still restrained to a bed as the remaining members of the medical and research team fled the room. I won't be in here locked with these things. Not with you, he screamed at the man strapped to the table. What are you? He demanded. I must know. The subject smiled. Have you forgotten so easily? The subject asked. We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you put into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread. The researcher paused, then aimed at the subject's heart and fired. The EEG flatlined as the subject weakly choked out. So nearly free.